Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So you know a little bit about me, um, and I wonder, and I would like to welcome everyone who is interested in performance testing, especially for in performance testing of web applications. So I would like to tell you something about my journey in this area. So everything started like 3 years ago, where when we have a really demanding client who want to has a site which will be the best or the fastest site in his let's say among his competitors. And at that time, we were trying to find some tools that will help us deliver the site as fast as his needs. So I investigated some tools that were available at that time and discovered that there is a quite broad subject of measuring performance from a user perspective, and that's how my journey started. I'm not sure who of you knows something about performance measurement from the user perspective. Raise your hands. Okay, so it seems that like this subject is known, is becoming more popular. Just to let you know, around the world, I think it became more popular and it gained a lot of attention. And I observed it for the last 3 years. Initially, we have just small tools which were very immature, and it was really difficult to use them. And nowadays, we have quite really good set of standard tools that actually you should incorporate in any project that is doing something related to web application, because those tools will help you improve the performance. Even if your application will not be used by hundreds of users, still it's worth to check how good it is, how fast it is, and if your user will be satisfied. And around this subject, there are several conferences, there are several books, and you can observe that even on Google I/O, every year you have at least 2 talks related to this subject. So I think it's worth to gain some, to invest some time and do some checks, check the tools that I will present to you, and learn a little bit about this. And my objective for today is to give you a background related to performance testing from user perspective, and also give you some tools that you can use right away after this presentation. When you go to your companies, to your work, you can really start measuring performance and immediately give some feedback to your developers, to your supervisors, and in that way improve performance. I think those tools will help you assess performance, so give you some metrics, but those tools will also help developers improve the structure of the pages and improve the performance of the pages in the future. And to let you know, most of advices that will be presented or given by those tools are very simple and are related to just changing some switches in the server, maybe adding some tools to the build chain, or doing some tweaks in the application, and you can get really good results and really interesting improvements when it comes to performance. So I recommend to take a look at the recommendation and the results that those tools present and try to incorporate this in your build process. Okay, so you know a little bit about me, so I skip this slide and I go straight to the next one, which is actually about performance in general and measuring performance from user perspective and what this actually means. Who of you is doing performance testing right now? Okay, so what tools do you use? Gatling, yeah.
We also have JavaScript library that sends metrics, so we also analyze them in production.
Mm-hmm.
And like some in-house made tools.
Okay, so some scripts that collect the data and parse it and present it in a nice way. Who else raised his hand? Oh, someone in the background. What are you using? JMeter. And are you happy with it? Quite yes. Okay. So those tools are really good. for measuring performance, but on the server side. Those tools were designed to load the server with a bunch of requests and collect metric which is called time to first byte or time to the last byte. Unfortunately, when user use our application, he doesn't care when the bytes are delivered to him. He cares about what's going on in the browser, either in his desktop application or in his mobile device. So the metrics that we have from the tools like Gatling or JMeter are very good for analyzing how performant server is. However, if you would like to know what user thinks about our application, those tools will not tell us much. And even if we will really try to make our script as close to the real traffic, and we will try to simulate the real browser as much as possible, still we will never get the results similar to the results that are perceived by user. Mainly because the user use a browser who needs to process all the content that is delivered by server. It needs to process the main HTML file. We need to download JavaScript files, CSS files, images, and then he needs to execute JavaScript code that is embedded in our website. So by measuring performance from user perspective, I will mean measuring performance using a browser. And the motivation for this talk is actually to answering the question, how fast is my page loaded? And is it fast enough? And I will try to tell you some ways how you can build your methodology to assess is your site fast enough, and to actually measure if it's measure how fast it is loaded. So I mentioned that in order to get metrics from the user perspective, we will need a browser. So you may think, okay, I will open the browser, I will go to the network panel, and here I can see some numbers. So how about selecting one of those numbers and treat it as a metric for our performance testing, and as a result and approximation of user experience. So let's look at those metrics. First one, it's called finished. So what do you think? What does it mean? Pardon? Okay, so I think you are mathematic. So you think that there is some relation, and not quite sure, not quite correct. Any other ideas? Okay, almost good. Just pay attention to the fact that you are on the network panel. Yeah, exactly. So this means that browser loads all the assets. You can see it here. Those lines represent the asset on the page, and those small bits represent when this asset was loaded. So you can see here that this asset was loaded at this point, and more or less it was done after 7 and almost 8 seconds. So we might think it's a good metric for us. Browser finish its work, it downloads all the content, so it seems like a perfect metric for measuring performance using a browser. But there are some pitfalls in it. First of all, sometimes you will not see this number because the browser will constantly download something. For example, it will poll for new data for example exchange rates. It will poll for exchange rates every second, and if this happens, browser will not know when he completed his work. He will actually do it all the time, so we will not get this number at all. Another thing is that you can see here that those resources that were downloaded recently at the beginning of at the end of the process, well, but there might be some small images, some actually here we have only small images and some small JavaScript. They might be not really related to what is presented by the browser. So actually maybe full page is visible for a user. However, browser needs to do some additional tasks to be ready for a next entrance, or well, there are many ways that many reasons why browser could do something more after he loads and present content to the user. So this metric is not a perfect one. So how about those two? Who knows what do they express? Sorry for question. You come for presentation and I'm asking questions. Okay, so in order to understand what those numbers mean, let's go to the next slide. Oh, if I it's strange because they are switching here. Okay, thanks. So when browser loads our page, it informs the environment about different parts of the job that he has done and he has completed. So when we enter new address, you can see that we prompt browser is prompt for unload the old page, and then we start navigation. And when we do some stuff related to the network, which is searching for a DNS, trying to set up a TCP connection, and then we sending request, and then we get response. And from that, until that point, everything is responsible for everything. Server is responsible, and from that point, we start browser processing, and browser indicates this by sending event which is called DOM loading. That means that browser starts processing HTML file and is trying to build the structure that will help browser present the content of the screen. At some point during the processing of the page, browser indicates that now the DOM is interactive, so user can do some stuff on the page. Later on, it tells us that actually DOM content is loaded. So that means that all the structure is done and some required elements are also loaded, but there are still some processing. At the end, browser informs the environment that DOM processing is completed with a DOM complete event. So we know that at that point, more or less, whole HTML document has been parsed and most resources were visible, and during this moment browser at least loaded the most important content that is required to present the site. So let's see what does it mean. Okay, so when I press the enter, you will see the page that will be loaded, and you will see two signs. On the left side, you will see the time until DOM content loaded event is fired, and on the right side, you will see when DOM completed event is fired. So you will be able to see what is the difference between those two events. So you see, currently DOM content loaded event was fired relatively fast, and at that point of time we see all the text on the page, but still page needs to requires this image, and until this image was loaded, we couldn't see anything here, and when all the resources of the page were downloaded, then this text appears here, and that indicates that the load content was visible. So that gives us some hints about what those two numbers present. more or less at DOM content loaded event, we should expect some part of the website visible, and when DOM is completed, we should expect more or less all the site visible. And that would be true if this part will be missing. And this part is the part where developers can put some additional JavaScript code that will download some additional resources, including other JavaScript files, CSS files, and additional images. So actually, for old applications, DOM completed and DOM content loaded were quite good approximation for what's going on the browser from the visual side. For a new application, those two events might be a little bit misleading because a lot of things happen during the onload phase when JavaScript code provided by your developers is executed. So let's search for something else that we can use. And here you can see another approach for measuring performance from user perspective. It's an approach that requires downloading or actually collecting, or creating the movie during the process of loading the page. And then this movie is somehow processed, and we know when different elements of the page appeared, and then we can draw some chart that will tell us how many objects at given point of time were visible on the web. So you can see here that for this page, nothing was actually visible until 2 seconds, and then we have almost above 75% of the content, and then we need to wait additional second for some parts, and then we need to wait approximately 3 seconds to have a fully loaded page. So those metrics give a new quality for us, and they allow us for reporting new things, not only based on the events from the browser, but also or actually checking what is visible for the users. And out of this graph, you can get metrics like visually complete and the percentages of visually completeness. So it's 85%, 90, 95, and 99. So looking at this chart, you can see several interesting things and also several problems. First of all, we can see that start rendering happened approximately after 2 and 8 seconds. And DOM content loaded event was fired much later. So that means that for this page, actually we see a little, quite many things before DOM content loaded event was fired. And when we look at those statistics, we will see that actually before DOM content loaded event was fired, actually almost 95% of the page was visible. So actually all the page was visible except some small bits that might not be really important to the user. So those kind of metrics give us a way to measure performance in a much better way. And the tool that allows for doing this is called web page test. Now it disappeared. And this is how it looks. Here is the public instance of this tool, and here you can put the address of any website that you'd like to test. You can select location from which you would like to test, because this is also something very important for measuring, for doing performance tests from from different locations around the world. You can get different results. So you can select from which place you would like to get the measurements. Then you can select the browser, connection speed, and how many tests you would like to run. And there are some other quite interesting options that I will not cover in this presentation. And when you execute the test, after a couple of seconds, you will have a result like this that will tell you it will give you some statistics about the page loaded, give you some additional browser-based statistics, and when you enter the film strip view, you will be able to see what user saw at each defined time, and in that way you will be able to assess what is actually going on during the process of loading a site. And below you will see the chart that I show you, so you can it will visualize how visual progress moved, and you can also see the statistics which I show you to you earlier. So I encourage you to use this tool to test your sites and get some measurements right away. And this tool also provides you with some guidelines about how to improve the performance and what you can do to make your sites better. Okay, so we know that we have new metrics and we can use it, but is it still sufficient for us? What do you think? Well, first of all, which metric should we report? Of course, visually complete is one of the metric, but you can see from this chart that the page was almost completed at around 3 seconds after it was loaded, and a lot of content was actually downloaded at this area. So maybe we don't need to wait and report to us the page load time as a 6 second. Maybe it will be better to report 85% of visual completeness as our metric. And this makes sense. However, it will differ between applications that we will use and we will test. So I think this can give us some hints, but still this is not a metric that we would like to have. We would like to have 1 or 2 numbers that will show us what's going on in the browser. So actually, smart guys introduce 2 additional metrics that I will also describe while talking about the next tool. Okay, so while waiting for a screen, I will explain this, describe this tool to you. So the tool is called Lighthouse, and for a while it was an extension to Chrome, but nowadays Google incorporated it, and it's a standard tool available in the Chrome developer tools. And this tool will examine your site and do some audits, and this tool will actually provide you with, again, some hints about the structure of your site and what could be improved. And this tool provides you also with some additional metrics that are actually quite interesting. So the metrics I'm talking about is the first contentful paint and first meaningful paint. So first contentful paint is a metric that tells us when something useful for user was painted for the first time. It could be an image, it could be a text, it could be something. It differs from the time to start rendering in that way that time to start rendering reports even if just one pixel was on the screen. First contentful paint tells us when something more visible to user, like a text or image, was visible. So that is a starting point for a user journey. And then we have another metric which is called first meaningful paint, and that more or less means that some meaningful content was delivered to the user. And how this metric is collected. Oh, it's a bad time for our colleague. Okay, so to explain how first meaningful content metric is calculated, it's good to look at this example. And the first meaningful paint is a paint that delivers the most significant change in the view. So we can see here that the most significant change happened around 2.4 seconds, and we see this big increase in that area. So more or less this will be the time that will be reported by first meaningful paint, and we can see it here. Apparently for this side, first contentful paint and first meaningful paints are equal, but it's not the case. In testing your site, you might have here slightly different results. And what is also quite important for user is ability to interact with the application. So we have two another metrics. One is time to interactive. So this metric tells us when users start to do something with the web. So it can press the button, it can fill the form, because it's not obvious that when the page is visible, user can start doing those actions. Sometimes JavaScript occupies all the processor time, and then user can't do anything and needs to wait until some idle processor time appear. And then we have estimated input latency. So it is also metric that will tell us how fast user can interact with the application. Okay, so those metrics improve the way we can measure performance, but still for some guys it's not enough, and I will tell you a little bit about the next technique, which is called hero image measurements. And what it actually means? Well, first, all the metrics that I presented so far, all the visual metrics, measure the amount of the content that is visible on the screen. However, not all content is equal. Some pictures, some elements are more interesting for a user, and some are not. And to solve the issue, this concept of hero measurements was introduced, and user or developer can select what is actually important for his application and take a measurement until this particular element is visible. So, for example, Twitter is using this technique for a quite long time, and Twitter, when measuring performance, they care about the time until first tweet is visible, because they assess that, well, once user can read the first tweet, that make user happy, and then in the background while he is reading this tweet, they can download additional resources, additional tweets, and all this kind of stuff. So for them, the metric that they care about is a time to first tweet. And actually, to be able to use this metric, it's good that you define with a customer, with your supervisors, which elements are important for your site, and then try to incorporate some small markups in the code to be able to measure time until those elements are visible. If you don't want to add additional code to your application, there are some heuristics that can help you decide which elements are hero, and tools like speed curve can help you, and those tools measure the time until the first H1 header is rendered, and also time until the first largest image is rendered. And you can use those default metrics just out of the box without any intervention, and that is a solution that you can start with. Okay, so we know two tools. It's web page test. We know Lighthouse. We know something about the metrics, and using those tools in the way I show you might be a little bit difficult, especially now when we would like to automate our test and we would like to be informed that something is wrong by our build tools. So the tool that can help you is called SiteSpeed.io, and that tool is a command line tool that allows us for scheduling tests using web page test or Lighthouse, or even some internal site speed tools from the command line. And then this tool is delivered with a Grafana dashboard, predefined Grafana dashboards that you can see here. And using, I think, 3 or 4 commands and setting some task in the cron, you can in 20 minutes build environment that will report performance of any website you would like to monitor, and you will get such nice information, such nice dashboards that will not only inform you about the metrics, but will also inform you about how those metrics change over the time. So this is a great tool if you would like to use, if you would like to automate the process of collecting metrics. Okay, so I think I will summarize now. So I would like to wrap up most important part of the presentation. And so when it comes to tools, I strongly recommend you to use web page test or Lighthouse and see how those tools are working. You can use them directly from the web, or you can build really fast environment that will show you the dashboards that are behind me. So that's the one part. Another thing is, think about the metrics that you should collect for your application. Is visual completeness enough? Do we need to care about hero elements? And maybe we also need to think about time to interact, because our application has some issues in this area. Take a look at the recommendations that are provided by those tools, recommendations about how to improve your site, and try to define the hero element for your site if all the other metrics are not enough. Okay, so that was all from my side, and now it's time for questions.